The concept cycles of contention emerges out of social movement analysis in the United States and is associated, in particular, with the work of Tarot. To understand it, we must first grasp the concept of contention. This is a term used by some social movement analysts to widen the scope of their focus beyond social movements, to incorporate a range of forms of political activity and protest, which might not quite meet the criteria of their definition of social movements, but which do not belong to the domain of formal, institutionalized politics either. Social movement formation and activism would be one form of contention or contentious politics, but there would be others, such as riots, spontaneous protests and strikes, or industrial unrest. According to Tarot, social movements grow out of contentious politics and are characterized relative to other forms of contention by their relative durability. They are sustained over time. Contentious politics occurs when ordinary people, often in league with more influential citizens, join forces in confrontation with elites, authorities, and opponents. When backed by dense social networks and galvanized by culturally resonant, action-oriented symbols, contentious politics leads to sustained interaction with opponents. The result is the social movement. There is always some level of contention in any advanced society at any time. However, the concept of cycles of contention suggests that this level varies in a cyclical fashion. That is, it suggests that levels of contention move between peaks and troughs. At some times, there are very high levels of contention. Protests are big, frequent, and significant. The number of social movements in society increases, and the activity levels of those movements is extraordinarily high. At other times, the level drops. These cycles of boom and bust are not said to be regular. They do not recur at set intervals, but it is argued that they manifest a relatively predictable structure. Moreover, the concept of cycles was introduced in an effort to correct the view, evident in some work on political crises or moments of madness, that these moments can erupt at any time without prior indication in the body of previously stable societies. Moments of madness was an expression coined by Zollberg to capture those moments in history and politics, such as Mai 68 in Paris, when political authorities wobble and anything seems possible. There is a danger with this idea, Tarot suggests, that we are led to believe that societies pass from perfect stability to near collapse in precisely a moment, only then to return immediately to stability. In contrast to this view, the idea of cycles of contention entails that there is a gradual buildup and wind down of levels of contention over a sustained period. Exactly how long is not specified, but the implication is longer than just a few weeks. Moments of madness, from this point of view, do not emerge out of nowhere. They are the culmination of a much more sustained and gradual buildup of levels of protest. Furthermore, as such, they might be predicted before the event. The distinction between the concept of moments of madness and the concept of cycles of contention can be illustrated in graphic form. The key example for most of the work on cycles is the period of political unrest in much of Europe and North America between the mid-1960s and the mid-1970s. This cycle has been studied in great detail, both quantitatively and qualitatively, in a number of national contexts, and has effectively served as the model upon which this concept is based. There are other examples, however, which suggests that the idea has wider applicability. Many explanations of the comings and goings of cycles focus upon a range of factors which are quite commonly cited in the social movements literature in relation to the comings and goings of single movements, such as political opportunity structures and frames. As McAdam notes, however, what is interesting about this concept is the fact that it draws attention away from singular groups or movements and requires us to focus upon the interaction between groups and movements over time. It enables us to reflect upon the way in which groups and movements collectively constitute an environment for one another, as well as provocation and inspiration. Feminist groups might steal the limelight from environmentalist groups, for example, leading the latter to emulate the tactics of the former until peace campaigners enter the fray with their innovations, forcing both parties to respond, and so on. As a final point, we should note the methodological difficulties associated with the concept of cycles of contention. These revolve around the questions of how we accurately measure levels of protest in society at any given time. In practice, most theorists of cycles draw upon newspaper reportage. That is, analysts record the number of protests reported in the newspaper over given periods of time as a proxy for the number of protests actually occurring in society at any point in time. There are fairly obvious limits to this source of data, however, as a vast amount of protest activity, itself an ambiguous concept, goes unreported, and more importantly, the wax and wane of coverage may reflect the wax and wane of journalists' or editors' interest rather than genuine increases in protest levels. An increase in reported protests might indicate a media campaign or moral panic regarding protest rather than a genuine increase, and the media may lose interest in protest or find something else that they are more interested in reporting at the time that the real level of protests is increasing. Furthermore, novel protests are more likely to be reported than standard protests, and all forms will become standard and lose their news value over time. There are doubtless ways of getting around these problems. One might argue that the media is a good measure of those protests which really penetrate public consciousness, and that this is what is important. Objective rises in protest levels are of little significance, one might claim, unless they get reported and people learn about them. Similarly, one might argue that a buildup of protest levels to crisis point will be noted by the media because it will always be newsworthy. Objective rises in protest levels are of little significance, one might claim, unless they get reported and people learn about them. Similarly, one might argue that a buildup of protest levels to crisis point will be noted by the media because it will always be newsworthy. Finally, one might argue that cycles will always work through the media, relying upon media amplification for growth, such that media reporting and actual levels of protests are closely interdependent. It must suffice to say that though the concept of cycles is fascinating and important, we must be mindful of the methodological difficulties, which are sometimes overlooked by its more enthusiastic proponents.